Lecture 23 is called The Age of Revolutions. This is part one. We'll do a second lecture on the Age of Revolutions as well and go in a little more detail. Let's define revolution first of all. It's a violent attempt to change the political system, to introduce new political actors, and to promote social change. This is different from a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is an overthrow of state. This is a sudden violent overthrow of a government by a small group usually, including the police, intelligence services, armed forces, and a rival faction seeking power. Wars of independence are usually not revolutions, although they may have some aspects of revolutionary activity to them. Revolutions do not generally change everything, no matter how ambitious they are. Portions of the old regime always survive. Just think of the difference between the American and French revolutions. The American Revolution came first. It severed the ties between the American colonists and the mother country in Great Britain. The French Revolution was much more fundamentally upsetting, a genuine upheaval in French society, destroying institutions that had stood for 1,000 years, sort of remaking society fundamentally. So you could say that the American Revolution is a war of independence, right? It's not truly revolutionary. It's more of a political act, whereas the French Revolution is an incredibly ambitious attempt to remake man. Remember our earlier revolutionary period? The end of the 18th century saw a series of revolutions in the Atlantic Basin: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s. 20th century revolutions, think about Turkey at the early part of the 20th century. This is a revolution from above, imposed by the leadership on the country, an attempt to modernize the country essentially. Of course, we have the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to 1920. Here we have a variety of grievances among numerous groups vying for control. You have peasant revolutionaries under Pancho Villa. You have urban revolutionaries in the cities. Some land reform is achieved in these Mexican revolutions. The so-called Revolutionary Party takes over and continues through the 20th century. But there's no real peripheral damage or spillover from the Mexican revolutions. They don't inspire, in other words, revolutions in the rest of Central and South America. Of course, we have the Chinese Revolution in the middle of the 20th century. But of course, this dates back to the early part of the century, where students and intellectuals overthrow the imperial system in 1911. They were striving for a Western-style parliamentary democracy. This revolution, of course, is hampered by the Japanese invasion of Japan. It's also hampered by the rising communist movement under Mao Zedong, slowed by the resistance of the landlord institutions in China. So we have ongoing chaos and social upheaval in China throughout the first half of the 20th century. And of course, we have the Russian Revolution. Again, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, you can track dissent and dissatisfaction all the way back to 1905, when Russia lost and was humiliated by Japan in their brief war. Peasant worker grievances build from that point. Some of you may know this story. Tsar Nicholas II, he abdicates the throne in 1917. You have a brief period here in the spring and summer of 1917 of potential liberal-style rule under Kerensky. But Kerensky is discredited because he continues the fighting in World War I and ongoing Russian defeats there. The Bolshevik Revolution sweeps Kerensky away in October of 17. The Soviet Union is established the next year by Lenin. This creates the world's first communist state. Now, closer in time to today is the Iranian Revolution. We're still living with the effects of it. It's the first great revolution in the so-called Third World. This was a way of organizing political science during the Cold War. The first world was the United States, Western Europe, the industrialized countries. The second world, that was the communist world, and then the third world were those peripheral countries. The Iranian Revolution was not based on Western ideas. Here, a Shia Muslim theocracy is established and is still in power today. Iran breaks its traditional relationship with the U.S. and the West. For the longest time, the Iranian government referred to the United States as the Great Satan. Now, is this Islamic revolution in Iran, is it a beacon to other Arab Muslims in the Middle East? It doesn't appear to be. This took place in 1979. I know the Middle East is still in turmoil, but the most recent rash of revolutions, the so-called Arab Spring, do not appear to be pointed towards theocracies, that is, the melding of church and state. Other revolutionary movements, Egypt, Bolivia, Cuba, of course, with Castro, Central American revolutions, and of course Vietnam, which the United States spent a lot of time, and effort, and blood. Now, let's characterize these 20th century revolutions a bit further. These revolutions generally start where the regime is weak and without widespread popular support. Tsar Nicholas II was regarded as weak and ineffective. The Shah of Iran was aging, he was oppressive, he was ill. In Mexico, a corrupt dictator swept aside. In China, a boy emperor is set aside. Revolutions are often made possible by war. The following quotes are from Robert Glately's Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler, the Era of Social Catastrophe. These couple of comments are admittedly Eurocentric, but they make important points that are applicable to world history. Quote, "But once the war monster was released in 1914, the social and political crises that swept across Europe opened up wholly new opportunities for radicals and for utopians." And we'll talk about this more when we talk about World War II. The First World War's social effects cannot be underestimated. All inhabitants of Europe were exposed to the militarization of life and language, the erosion of individual freedom and social differences, the disruption of economic life, the drain of wealth, the hardships caused by food shortages, the growth of collectivization and bureaucracies, the collapse of the international system, and the release of huge reservoirs of aggression and violence. Revolutions require a commitment to violence. The peasantry has often played this role or provided this energy. The peasants often want land reform. They want the abolition of the landlord class. The peasants seek social justice. And of course, revolutionary movements can originate in the cities as well, as we see in Russia and in Mexico with the urban working class or proletariat. Revolutions require ideological commitment. And this generally runs from the elite, the intellectuals, down to the workers, to the peasants. The dominant revolutionary ideology of the 20th century, of course, was Marxism. Marxist elite sort of riding history's wave and sort of guiding it as well. This inevitable flow of history that Marxism states, whereby we move from slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism and finally to communism. Of course, the Marxists argued that capitalism exploited the workers and called for its overthrow. Marxists essentially say that history is predetermined. That was one of the factors which gave the Marxists such self-confidence, is that they believed that they had discovered scientifically how and why history moves forward. They knew where it was going and they could help guide it there. A definite and certain future where inequalities in the state would wither away. This is the utopian vision of the communists, and of course it never came close to being true. A final factor here in this discussion on this first part of our discussion on revolutions, is Western influence. The Iranians in their revolution were preoccupied with the effects of Western influence on their country, and they wanted to throw the West out of their country, resume complete control over their oil reserves. Mexicans, of course, worried about American ownership of the railroads and of factories, and this was an incentive in the Mexican Revolution to sort of throw the Westerners out. And of course, the Russians were worried about foreign ownership of their factories as well. So the heavy hand of the West becomes a problem here in the 20th century in these revolutions, as nationalist groups from China to Russia to Vietnam to Mexico to Iran seek to regain their country and to throw Western influence out. We'll look in more detail in the second part of this lecture, especially at the Russian Revolution and the revolution that takes place in Germany as well in the middle of the 20th century. Thank you.